Hi, welcome back. Part 2, I promise you, is a little bit faster than Part 1. It was just really hard to find a good way to break these up into 2 equally long lectures. So here we go with Part 2. If you've taken a little break, I'm going to remind you about why we're doing this. The code provides a framework to make sure that we're treating participants fairly and we're protecting their rights and welfare. The code is important because it determines your responsibilities and how you act as a CRC. And learning the code helps you with analytical decision-making skills. These are really going to be important for you when you leave and you're working in the field. So there you go, a little reminder about why we're talking about this. Quick review, we did Part 11, electronic records and signatures. We did 50, the protection of human subjects, about the consent form process. We did 54, we just mentioned briefly, financial disclosures. And then 56, which is important, the institutional review boards. So that's what we did in the first lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about 312, which you're going to spend a lot of time in. It's very long, and it's really important, investigational new drugs. Subpart A is general provisions. Not a lot in there. It is very general. The scope, the definitions, things like that. Important though is this one little bit in general provisions, labeling on all new drugs that are under investigation. So anything that's it's in clinical research under an IND has to have a label that reads, "Caution, new drug limited by federal or United States law to investigational use." That has to go on everything, whether it's an IV, whether it's a patch, whether it's you're sending someone home with oral medications to use, that has to have this labeling on it. Your pharmacy, if you have an investigational pharmacy, they'll know to do that. And if not, the pharmacy that you use will have to be made aware. And that also charging a fee for a drug is generally not permitted. Rare exceptions that we're not going to get into here, but that investigational drugs under an IND are free. You cannot charge for them. Okay, Subpart B, Investigational New Drug Application, is important. We talked about that new drug application, the IND, in the very first module. And as a reminder, the IND has to be submitted before clinical trials can begin. Automatically after 30 days, it is renewed unless the FDA says no. So on day 31, the clock starts ticking and phase 0 or 1 studies can start. After the IND is approved at 30 days, the drug can be shipped to the site from the sponsor and the treatment of patients can begin, not a day beforehand. And in this section 2, it says the IND and the protocol format. The protocol is the document that you're going to use to conduct the trial, is very specific and it's outlined in this area. The good news is the IND is written by the sponsor, so you need to be aware of it. You need to understand how it impacts you as a research coordinator, but you're not going to write it. And the sponsor is responsible for all ongoing review of safety data from everywhere, from any and all sources. That means if there's still preclinical trials going on, all those animal studies will still count. And for every participant that's gone on a clinical trial with that drug, the sponsor is responsible for the safety data. Because think about this reasonably. The FDA is going to approve a new drug based on safety and efficacy. So safety gets to be an important data point on every trial at all times. So there's something called the IND Safety Report, the Investigational New Drugs Safety Report. This involves adverse events. So the adverse events are like the side effects. Remember, we're going to call them adverse events from here on out. The IND Safety Report does not have to say whether the drug caused the adverse event. It's just that there was an adverse event. So there's no association with the drug that is required. And there are two ways you're going to have to report as a research coordinator safety adverse events to the sponsor. The sponsor is responsible for reviewing the data, but it comes from you because remember, the investigator gets the patients and the patients create the data. So the safety report initially starts with the coordinator because the coordinator knows what's going on with the patients. So there are 2 adverse event reporting guidelines here, and the first one is 15 calendar days, not 15 business days, and that's important to note because those weekend and holidays will count against you. Adverse event that is serious and unexpected, and we'll talk about this later in the semester. That gets to be you, or any new preclinical data, which is the sponsor. But the adverse event that comes from a participant that is serious and unexpected has to be reported in 15 calendar days. 7 calendar days, it's half the timeline, a little bit under half the timeline, is for adverse events that are unexpected, fatal, or life-threatening. We'll talk a little bit later in the semester the difference, and we'll get into some of the details, the difference between the 7 calendar day and the 15 calendar day. But these IND safety reports have to be reported very promptly. They can't be reported semi-annually or annually. So these have to go to the sponsor very quickly. Administration actions. So administratively, it's talking about what the FDA can do. The FDA can place a study on hold. If no trials have been started yet, they just basically says, we're putting it on hold and you may not enroll any participants. If the studies have already started and they're ongoing, this means that you can't enroll any new patients on the study, and anybody who is an existing patient should probably be disenrolled unless the FDA instructs otherwise. So 2 options here. Either the trials aren't allowed to start or everyone has to get off the train. The FDA can terminate an IND at any time. The IND is going to be in place until the time that the sponsor says, at the end of phase 3 studies, we would like to submit a new drug application. So this can be years and years at time, and the FDA can terminate it at any time. Typically, this is for risk. There's also a section which addresses what happens if the sponsor decides to inactivate a study. When can the sponsor meet with the FDA? If the sponsor has a dispute with the FDA, how does that get resolved? So that's really for the sponsor to worry about. But I want you to know what the FDA can do to an IND. Subpart D is responsibility of sponsors and investigators. This is where you're going to spend a lot of time. This is important for you as the research coordinator. I think this has the most meat in it in Subpart D. So what are some of the sponsor responsibilities? The first thing they have to do is select qualified investigators, and we'll talk later about what it means to be qualified. But they have to pick people who are in their field. You wouldn't want a gynecologist performing a dermatology study, for example. So the sponsor has to find investigators who are qualified. The sponsor has to obtain an FDA Form 1572 from all the investigators. In this module, excuse me, I have posted an FDA Form 1572, and it is not a very long document, and basically in its agreement, and the investigator says, gives some information, where is the clinic located, where's the lab, some basic stuff like that, but most importantly, the investigator signs it and says, I'm going to follow the Code of Federal Regulations when I do this trial. So it's a legally binding agreement between the, by the investigators say that they will comply with all of the law. So yes, to assure compliances with FDA regulations. Obtain financial information from the investigators. This is important because of that conflict of interest, the financial disclosure law. More sponsor responsibilities, ensuring investigators follow the study protocol. So it's one thing for that investigator to sign the Form 1572 and say, I promise I'm going to do a good job, I'm going to follow all the laws, I'm going to follow the study protocol. This is where, remember we talked about the CRA, the Clinical Research Associate, which we call the study monitor. This is where the monitor comes out on a regular basis and makes sure that the investigator, and by virtue of delegation, the research coordinator, are following the study protocol. The sponsor also has to ensure that significant new adverse events and risks are promptly reported. This is why when we talk about the 15-day calendar IND report, it's really important that those are being reported promptly to the sponsor because they count on you for that. Ensuring that all distributed investigational drug is maintained in a secure manner. This will include knowing how much drug you have, so accurate inventory of the drug, but that it's maintained so that people will not get their hands on it if they're not in the clinical trial. Maintaining records including shipment logs, investigator financial interest, reserve samples, things like that. The sponsor is going to be responsible for knowing where every bit of their investigational drug is maintained. And then the sponsor is also responsible for storing records for 2 years, either 2 years following the approval of the drug for sale and distribution, or 2 years following the termination of the IND. So the investigator responsibility is then following that 1572 commitment, protecting patient rights and welfare, securing all the new investigational drug supplies. And you'll sometimes get into a lot of discussion with sponsors about what does securing mean. Does that mean just in a locked cabinet? Does that mean in a locked room? But it's in some manner making sure that that investigational drug is not able to be dispensed easily. Dispensing drug only to people who are enrolled on the trial, and maintaining drug accountability logs. So the sponsor has to know where all of their drug is at all times. That means that every investigator has to have an inventory that's accurate. So some type of drug accountability logs, including like the dates in which shipments were received, the dates in which drug was dispensed, those kinds of things, patient information. More investigator responsibilities, maintaining case histories. This is what we would really just call the medical record. Reporting all adverse events. We'll talk more about that later in the semester. Assuring the IRB review. So we have these three parties. We have the sponsor, we have the investigator, and we have the IRB. The IRB will really only deal with the investigator. The IRB typically does not do anything with the sponsor. The IRB is going to only deal with the investigator. So the investigator has that relationship with the IRB. You as the coordinator will do a lot of work with the IRB. So making sure that those reviews are happening, the initial review, the ongoing reviews, that kind of thing. The investigator is also responsible for assisting the sponsor in preparing annual and final reports. The sponsor is going to be required by the FDA to submit things annually. It's not just like I mentioned with the IRB, go ahead and do that study, good luck, hope it turns out okay. No, there's going to be some type of ongoing oversight that is required. And the sponsor is going to be relying on their sites to give them as much up-to-date information as possible. And then the investigator also has to do something with the unused drug upon completion of the trial. We haven't talked about contracts yet, but it's usually in the contract what will happen with that unused drug. Will the investigator ship it back to the sponsor? Will it be disposed of on site? Those kinds of things. But something has to happen when the trial is over and you have extra drug. You can't just keep it. You have to do something with it. And then also retaining records. Sponsor has to retain records. The investigator also has to retain records for 2 years, either after approval or 2 years after the IND termination. Typically what happens is that if you do early phase studies, it's really hard to keep track of when the IND was terminated or when the new drug was approved, so most sites will keep records far beyond the 2 years. There are some other things in Title 21, including 314, the application for FDA approval. This is really the sponsor's area, but you should know that that's where you could find it. 812, we talk about 312, we've been talking about 312 all through this. 812 is for investigational devices, so new heart valves, knee replacements, hip replacements, crutches, those are all in 812. And then 814 is also medical devices, if you're curious. But there's a lot more beyond what we talked about in these two lectures. There are also FDA guidances that are really helpful. The FDA guidances are really sort of nice abbreviated papers that reflect what the FDA is currently thinking about how the code is written. And so I like the FDA guidances. They're very helpful. They're very nice and easy to read. Sometimes the code is a little bit legalese, and sometimes it's a little heavy to read. So sometimes the guidances are really good. They're very helpful, but they're not legally binding. The Code of Federal Regulations is the federal law that we have to follow. But I would recommend using the FDA guidances as tools to help you get an idea of what the FDA thinks about the law. Easy to read compared to the code. And the draft versions are also open to public comment. So as you move into this role and you get some professional experience under your belt, the FDA will say, they will publish that it's open, there's a draft open for comment. And so if you really have some very serious thoughts about this, you can, lots of public comments go into these. And it helps the FDA to write them. So look at the guidances. We'll talk more about them later as well, but they will help you. So how do you comply, and as a coordinator, how do you assure compliance with Title 21, where it applies to you? We talked about the investigator all the way through, but the investigator delegates to the coordinator, so a huge amount of compliance is gonna be with you. Not everything, it's a team sport, but a lot of it's gonna rely with you. And so in order to be compliant with the law, we'll talk about these later in the semester. We have some lecture about standard operating procedures. This helps standardize activities across a variety of people and roles in a research center. Training helps a lot. But I mentioned before that training is sometimes very spotty. Training, you can rely a lot on training that you get from the sponsors about the protocol. But when in doubt, you can always check the code and guidances. And this is what I want you to be able to do when you leave this program, is to be independent and to know why you're doing what you're doing based on really good references. Not just what I told you or what your mentor at work told you. So again, the reference, the Code of Federal Regulations, go ahead in there and dig around a little bit if you're interested. We will use this this searchable database a lot when we get to good clinical practice. But anyway, there we go. We made it through the basis of FDA regulations as it applies to the clinical research coordinator. You know I love your questions. Please let me know if anything needs clarified. If you have a question, probably someone else does too. So thanks and take care. I'll talk to you soon.